A magical contract is any agreement where magic enforces the terms automatically once the conditions are accepted. If the enchantment recognizes intent and seals the agreement, the contract becomes binding and begins regulating the participants' actions. Unbreakable vows. An unbreakable vow is formed when two participants speak a set of conditions aloud, while a third person, the binder, channels stabilizing magic that locks each condition into a literal life-linked spell. The vow attaches a lethal curse to every stated term, and the magic monitors the participants' actions continuously, evaluating both behavior and intent to determine whether the vow is being honored. Breaking a condition does not require openly defying the agreement. The magic activates the moment a participant knowingly takes an action that violates the promise or deliberately fails to act when the vow requires fulfillment. The sealing process is precise. As each condition is spoken, the binder releases controlled streams of magic that wrap around the participants' hands, creating visible bands of light. These bands represent the contract's internal structure forming in real time, encoding each term and binding it directly to the participant's life force. Once the final condition is sealed, the vow becomes autonomous, enforcing itself without further involvement from the binder. Because the penalty is instantaneous death with no possibility of reversal, unbreakable vows are used only in situations where absolute compliance is required. Their rarity is due not only to the risk, but also to the legal and ethical implications of creating a magical contract with an automatic fatal consequence. Blood oaths and blood pacts. Blood oaths bind participants through their own blood, creating a magical link that monitors intent and prevents actions that would violate the agreement. When blood is shared during the formation of the pact, the magic anchors itself to each participant's life essence, allowing the contract to evaluate harmful intent rather than relying only on spoken conditions. This gives blood-based contracts a broader range of enforcement, blocking spells, disrupting physical actions, or resisting deliberate attempts to cause harm. Because the bond connects directly to the participants, the contract operates continuously and without external supervision. The blood pact between Dumbledore and Grindelwald illustrates how this magic can take physical form. Their combined blood is suspended inside a protective vial, which acts as the anchor for the pact and enforces the rule that neither wizard can directly attack the other. The defensive enchantments surrounding the object make the pact extremely difficult to break, requiring access to the vial and a method to dismantle the layered protections without triggering the guarding magic. Blood oaths are considered among the most advanced forms of binding magic, because they interact with a wizard's identity-level magic, rather than simple verbal agreements. Because the magic regulates entire categories of behavior and is nearly impossible to escape, a blood pact can be more restrictive and enduring than an unbreakable vow, whose consequences are direct but limited. Each pact is shaped by the individuals who created it, making its effects uniquely powerful. House elf contracts. House elf contracts operate as inherited magical bonds that link an elf's service to a wizarding family, with the magic enforcing obedience to direct commands. The contract interprets orders literally, which allows elves to exploit gaps in wording while still remaining bound to the family they serve. Because the bond focuses on loyalty and subordination, the magic prevents elves from acting in ways that would deliberately harm their master, but it does not restrict elves from using their own magic for self-punishment or independent tasks. The release mechanism relies on clothing, which the contract recognizes as a symbolic transfer of ownership. When a master gives an elf an article of clothing, the magic dissolves the existing bond immediately, freeing the elf from all obligations.
Presented Dobby with clothes. Dobby is free.
This rule functions universally across house elves, regardless of family, location, or duration of service, making clothing the only consistent and universally accepted way to terminate the contract. Elves can navigate around certain commands if the wording is imprecise, allowing limited resistance or subtle interpretation that maintains obedience while influencing outcomes. These loopholes exist because the magic enforces the literal terms of the order rather than the master's unspoken intent. Since house elf contracts persist across generations, the bond renews automatically, making it one of the longest-standing forms of binding magic used in wizarding society. Goblin contracts and ownership law. Goblin contracts operate on the principle that the creator of an object retains true ownership unless specific transfer conditions recognized by Goblin tradition are met. When a wizard purchases a Goblin-crafted item, the transaction grants possession rather than permanent ownership, meaning the object should return to the maker or their descendants upon the buyer's death. This distinction explains repeated disputes over artifacts such as Godric Gryffindor's sword, since goblins view craftsmanship, not long-term possession, as the defining feature of rightful ownership. These contracts also define how inheritance and transfer are handled. If an item changes hands without meeting goblin standards for legitimate transfer, goblins consider the exchange invalid regardless of wizarding law. Many goblin-made objects contain enchantments that reflect this philosophy by responding only to rightful owners under goblin definitions, which can conflict with wizard assumptions about property rights. The magic behind goblin contracts enforces terms automatically through the item's enchantments, rather than through a formal spell placed on the buyer. The enchantment recognizes misuse, unauthorized transfer, or attempts to alter the object's intended purpose, and it can withdraw cooperation or restrict the object's magical functions. Because these rules are deeply rooted in goblin culture and magical theory, conflicts often arise from incompatible interpretations of ownership rather than violations of written agreements. Wizarding marriage and family oaths. Wizarding marriage contracts use old magic to formalize alliances between families, establishing obligations related to property, inheritance, and mutual support. Once both families agree to the terms, the enchantment binds the participants and enforces the conditions automatically, ensuring financial responsibilities, lineage expectations, and shared protections remain stable across the duration of the marriage. These contracts can also define restrictions on dissolving the union, with certain terms requiring magical or legal fulfillment before separation is recognized by the enchantment. Family oaths operate on a broader scale by binding entire bloodlines to specific duties, such as preserving ancestral property, maintaining alliances, or protecting long-standing secrets. Because the oath attaches to lineage rather than individuals, the magic remains active across generations and responds to actions taken by descendants. Violating a family oath can weaken protective enchantments tied to the bloodline, restrict access to inherited magic, or trigger compulsion effects that prevent a family member from acting against the established terms. These systems were used most prominently by pure-blood families who relied on magically enforced agreements to preserve influence and maintain controlled inheritance structures. The durability of these bonds makes them difficult to renegotiate, since modifying or dissolving them often requires unanimous family approval and specialized magic capable of altering long-standing enchantments. The Triwizard Tournament Contract. The Triwizard Tournament contract activates the moment the Goblet of Fire releases a participant's name, as the enchantment interprets this action as a binding acceptance of the tournament's terms. The magic underlying the goblet is designed to override personal choice, meaning withdrawal is impossible once selection occurs, regardless of whether the individual knowingly entered their name. The contract compels the chosen champion to participate in all tasks, and maintains this requirement through continuous magical pressure that prevents avoidance or refusal. The enchantment is built on ancient binding magic that prioritizes the integrity and continuity of the tournament above individual circumstances. Even manipulation, such as submitting a name without the participant's consent, does not prevent the binding from attaching to the chosen person. The goblet focuses solely on the name it recognizes as a valid entry, and once accepted, the contract applies its obligations to that individual without reviewing intent or external context. The contract enforces participation by guiding the champion toward each task, blocking attempts to escape, and escalating consequences if they attempt to violate the terms. Because the binding is integrated into the tournament's structure, the magic remains consistent regardless of school, judge decisions, or political disputes. Its goal is singular: ensure that every selected champion completes the tournament according to the established rules. Job contracts and institutional magical oaths. Job contracts in the wizarding world rely on magically reinforced obligations that activate once an individual formally accepts a position within institutions such as the Ministry of Magic or Hogwarts. These contracts often include confidentiality clauses enforced by magic that restrict the employee from sharing protected information. When a violation is attempted, the magic can block speech, prevent memory access, or create discomfort strong enough to stop disclosure. The binding adapts to the role, meaning higher security positions, such as Department of Mysteries roles or senior Auror posts, carry stronger restrictions. Auror oaths extend these requirements by enforcing behavioral standards tied directly to duty. The magic reinforces readiness, loyalty to assigned missions, and compliance with official protocol, preventing aurors from ignoring threats or abandoning responsibilities during active operations. Breaking the oath can weaken spellcasting precision, reduce access to certain combat spells, or activate penalties that restrict magical performance until the breach is corrected. Hogwarts contracts contain similar structures, but focus on student safety, curriculum duties, and school operations. The enchantments ensure that essential responsibilities cannot be ignored, especially during emergencies, by compelling staff to act in ways consistent with their role. Because these contracts integrate into the institution's magical foundation, the enforcement remains stable even when leadership changes, allowing the institution, not individual administrators, to regulate compliance. Wands-raised oaths and spoken magical promises. Wands-raised oaths create a magically reinforced promise by channeling a wizard's intent through their wand at the moment the terms are spoken. The act of raising the wand focuses the wizard's magical signature, allowing the oath to attach directly to their intent and emotional commitment. Because the binding depends on sincerity, the strength of the oath varies. A casually spoken promise forms a weak bond, while a deliberate, emotionally charged vow creates a strong magical constraint. The magic evaluates both wording and underlying intention, which means attempts to exploit technical loopholes are limited by how genuinely the wizard meant the promise. These oaths do not impose lethal consequences, but breaking one can generate magical resistance or interfere with spellcasting. When a wizard attempts to act against the oath, their magic may falter, misfire, or refuse to channel properly, creating a natural barrier that prevents deliberate violation. The binding persists until the terms are fulfilled, the promise becomes impossible to complete, or the original intent loses relevance, at which point the enchantment dissolves on its own. Because they can be formed quickly and without ritual components, wands-raised oaths are widely used for personal agreements, temporary commitments, and professional assurances that do not require the severity of formal contracts. Their flexibility makes them a common tool for wizards who need magically reinforced trust without long-term binding consequences. Cursed or enchanted contracts use embedded spells that automatically enforce conditions and apply penalties when a participant violates the agreement. These documents or objects contain enchantments that monitor compliance, activating hexes, binding effects, or pain-based curses if the terms are broken. The magic interprets violations according to the instructions woven into the contract, meaning the punishment occurs without the need for a caster to be present. Because enforcement is predetermined, the consequences activate instantly and cannot be negotiated after the contract is signed or accepted. Some cursed contracts require the participant to complete specific tasks, using escalating magical pressure if they resist. This pressure can restrict movement, impair spellcasting, or cause discomfort until the required condition is fulfilled. Other variants limit the participant's ability to act freely by imposing compulsion charms that direct behavior toward meeting the contract's terms. These mechanisms ensure completion, whether or not the participant remains willing. Enchanted contracts attached to objects may also regulate access, altering the item's functions when the user violates conditions or attempts unauthorized use. The object's magic remains active as long as the contract exists, maintaining enforcement independent of distance or time. Because the consequences can escalate, repeat, or inflict prolonged harm, these designs make them suitable for high-risk or heavily protected agreements.